History is written by the victors, but sometimes it is edited by the marketers. We all know him, a smiling, jolly little man in a bright green suit, chasing rainbows with a pot of gold. He is the mascot of St. Patrick's Day, the face of breakfast cereals, the harmless, whimsical clown of Hollywood comedies. But what if I told you that green suit is a lie? What if I told you that he was never a friend, and that the modern image of the leprechaun is actually a monument to a multi-billion-dollar cultural heist? To understand the scale of this deception, we have to peel back the layers of cheap plastic merchandise, the green beer, and the corporate logos. We have to go back to a time before Ireland was colonized, before its culture was sterilized, and before its ancient gods were turned into a commercial joke. For centuries, a silent war has been waged, not with swords or guns, but with symbols. And in this war, the leprechaun was the ultimate casualty. Stripped of his dignity, dressed in the clothes of his oppressors, and sold back to the world as a caricature. This is not a fairy tale about wishes and rainbow gold. This is a story of survival, of dark propaganda, and the genius of the marketers, who turned a proud, ancient guardian into a safe, sanitized captive. To find the truth, we must go back 1,200 years into the cold, rain-soaked coasts of medieval Ireland. Long before the first English ships arrived, the Irish did not tell stories of tiny shoemakers in green jackets. In the 8th century, the creatures of the mist were known as the Luchorpán. The word itself comes from the Old Irish lu, meaning small, and corp, meaning body. But they were not cute, and they were certainly not harmless. In the ancient manuscripts, specifically the 8th century text known as The Adventure of Fergus MacLeody, we find the very first recorded encounter with these beings, and it plays out like a scene from a dark fantasy thriller. Fergus, the King of Ulster, falls asleep on the sandy shores of the sea. As he sleeps, the tides begin to turn, and from the dark, freezing depths, they emerge. They were not forest dwellers, they were water spirits. Imagine slick, dark humanoids rising from the churning white foam with tangled seaweed hair and piercing, bioluminescent green eyes that glow in the midnight fog. These tiny, fierce entities crawl onto the beach, silent as shadows. They grab the sleeping king and begin dragging him towards the ocean, intending to drown him in the freezing, starlit waves. But the cold water touches Fergus's feet, and he awakens. In a flash of panic, the king reaches out, catching 3 of them in his powerful grip. Caught and helpless, the chief of the water spirits begs for mercy. "Life for life!" the creature cries. In exchange for their freedom, the Luchorpán grant the king 3 wishes, including a supernatural power, the ability to breathe underwater in any lake or sea in Ireland. This was the original leprechaun, a dangerous primordial force of nature, dwelling in the abyss, bargaining with kings, and wielding the power of life and death. As the centuries passed and the old pagan ways merged with Christian folklore, the Luchorpán came ashore. They retreated from the cold ocean waves into the ancient silent barrows and the hollow hills of the Irish countryside. They became part of the Aes the people of the mounds, the remnants of Ireland's fallen pagan gods. And as they evolved, they became the dandy aristocrats of the fairy world. If you traveled through Ireland in the 18th or 19th century and spoke to the local storytellers, they would have laughed if you asked about a green suit. Because the true leprechaun was dressed in brilliant, royal red. In the historical writings of Samuel Lover in 1831, and later in the compilations of William Butler Yeats, his appearance is described with meticulous, striking detail. He was a gentleman, a proud, dignified figure. He wore a square-cut, scarlet-red coat, richly laced with real gold thread. On his head sat a cocked hat, a tricorn, and on his feet, leather shoes with polished silver buckles. Yates specifically noted that the leprechaun's red coat was adorned with exactly 7 rows of bright brass buttons. He was a solitary fairy, a master craftsman, the official cobbler of the fairy royalty. When he worked, you could hear the distant, rhythmic clicking of his tiny hammer echoing through the misty hills, a sound the Irish call the click of the elvish hammer. And his gold? It was not a cheap gimmick. It was the ancient sacred treasure of the Tuatha De Danann, the old gods. It was property of the Celtic soil itself. Hidden away in secret underground chambers, protected from the greed of mortal men. To catch a leprechaun was to capture a piece of Ireland's sovereign soul. But to keep your eyes on him was almost impossible. He was a master of distraction, and the moment you blinked, he was gone, back into the red-coated silence of the woods. But then, in 1845, the sky over Ireland turned black. The Great Famine struck, a devastating blight that rotted the potato crops, the sole survival food of the Irish peasantry. Over 1 million people starved to death in their cottages, while English merchant ships continued to export Ireland's grain under armed guard. To escape the starvation, another 2 million Irish families packed their meager belongings, clutched their children, and boarded the notorious coffin ships bound for America. They arrived at the docks of New York and Boston, weak, sick, impoverished, and desperate for work. But they did not find a warm welcome. The American Protestant elite saw this massive influx of Catholic refugees as a threat to their society. They viewed the Irish as subhuman, diseased, ignorant, and inherently violent. And to justify the brutal discrimination, the low wages, and the squalid conditions the Irish were forced to live in, the media of the 19th century deployed a weapon. They created a caricature. They called him Paddy. In the widely circulated pages of major magazines, most notably Harper's Weekly, cartoonists like Thomas Nast drew the Irish with ape-like faces. They gave them protruding jaws, low foreheads, hairy, coarse skin, and wild, drunken expressions.
Out of my way!
They depicted the Irish immigrant as a violent, unruly beast, a threat to civilization itself. And what did this caricature wear? Paddy was always drawn in filthy, shredded, bright green rags, a battered top hat, and crude buckled shoes, often carrying a bottle of whiskey and a wooden club. Green, the sacred color of Irish rebellion, was deliberately weaponized and turned into a badge of poverty, ignorance, and shame. The media magnates of the 19th century had successfully associated the Irish identity with the image of a green-clad, ape-like clown. As the decades rolled on, the Irish immigrants survived. They built America's railroads, they filled its police forces, they entered its politics, and their culture began to weave itself into the fabric of the nation. But the media magnates realized a crucial thing: they could not destroy Irish culture. So instead, they chose to sanitize it. And this is where the Heist becomes a masterpiece of corporate marketing. They took the ancient, proud, red-coated fairy nobleman, the keeper of Ireland's soil, and they fused him with the ugly, racist Paddy caricature. They stripped away the scarlet coat, the gold lace, the 7 rows of brass buttons, and the connection to the ancient gods. They dressed him in the bright green clothes of the propaganda and gave him the cheerful, harmless, toothless grin of a captive. The final fatal blow was delivered in 1959. Walt Disney released a live-action fantasy film called Darby O'Gill and the Little People. Disney had traveled to Ireland years prior, claiming to search for authentic folklore. but what he produced was the ultimate sterilization. In a single movie, the Leprechaun, King Brian Connors, was officially dressed in green, given a thick, exaggerated American-Irish accent, and turned into a whimsical, bumbling, safe little joke. A few years later, in 1964, General Mills introduced a new breakfast cereal, Lucky Charms. And the mascot? A cheerful, green-suited, rainbow-chasing leprechaun named Lucky. The heist was complete. A symbol of ancient sovereignty, a guardian of sacred Celtic land, had been successfully transformed into a commercial salesman selling sugary marshmallows to American children. So, the next time you see a green mascot on a t-shirt, a beer commercial, or a box of cereal, remember that you are not looking at Irish folklore. You are looking at a crime scene. You are looking at a monument to a cultural robbery, a systematic rewriting of history designed to make a proud, colonized people look harmless, silly, and safe. But the marketers and the Hollywood executives made a grave mistake. They forgot that you can change the clothes of a legend, but you cannot kill its spirit. The real leprechauns do not care about your St. Patrick's Day parades or your plastic green hats. They do not dwell in the neon lights of commercialized festivals. They are still out there in the ancient red-coated silence of the Irish woods, deep beneath the mossy roots of the ancient oaks, guarding what is truly theirs. They are waiting for a generation that is ready to look past the green lie and remember the red truth. But what about the other legends that were rewritten? What about the headless riders, the silent wardens of the Great Plague of 1832? Well, that is a story for another time.